Tonight, while I work in my workshop, I want to tell you the story of a man who painted the Mona Lisa, designed flying machines 4 centuries before airplanes existed, performed human dissections that modern medicine would spend hundreds of years catching up to, and mapped the chambers of the human heart with an accuracy that was not confirmed by cardiology until 1969. And yet, he died in a small house in France, far from everything he had built. With his right hand paralyzed, most of his greatest discoveries locked in private notebooks no one had read, and the quiet conviction that he had wasted his life. That tension between what he actually achieved and what he believed about himself is what I want to explore tonight. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in a workshop, not the silence of an empty room. This silence lives between sounds, the drag of a plane across a board, the knock of a mallet, the whisper of sandpaper in long, slow strokes. It has texture. It is the silence of someone paying close attention. I have spent years in this workshop. My father worked here before me. The tools on the wall are old tools, worn smooth where a hand grips them, stained with work that goes back decades. They carry something in their weight, in the way they respond to pressure, that no book teaches. Every craftsman who used them left something behind. What they left was attention. The accumulated attention of people who looked carefully at a specific thing for a very long time. Leonardo da Vinci did that for 67 years. He did it to everything. The wood in front of me tonight is oak, heavy and old. It pushes back if you rush it. But when you learn the direction the grain wants to go and work with it rather than against it, the resistance disappears. That is, in essence, the story of Leonardo's entire life. Let us begin. To understand Leonardo da Vinci, you first have to understand the world he was born into. Because that world, its light, its politics, its contradictions, its sudden and extraordinary explosion of ideas, shaped everything about who he became. It is 1452. Italy does not yet exist as a country. What exists is a mosaic of city-states, each one a small republic or principality unto itself. Each one governed by its own laws, its own currency, its own alliances, its own ambitions. Florence, Milan, Venice, Rome, Naples. These are not simply cities, they are worlds. And the men who rule them are not simply politicians. They are patrons, warlords, philosophers, and sometimes murderers. Often, all 4 at once. The Renaissance has not yet been named. The people living through it do not call it that. They simply feel a shift, a loosening of something that had been tight for a very long time. The medieval world, with its absolute certainties about God and sin and the proper order of human life, is beginning to crack. Ancient Greek and Roman texts, long buried or forgotten, are being rediscovered. Scholars are reading Plato and Cicero and finding in those old words a new way of thinking about human possibility. The idea begins to take shape, quietly at first, then with gathering force, that a human being is not simply a vessel for sin waiting for judgment, that a human being is capable of something extraordinary. That thought is in the air in 1452. You cannot touch it or see it, but it is there. In the small Tuscan town of Vinci, on the 15th of April, 1452, a child is born. His mother is a young woman named Caterina. She is a peasant. There is a theory, seriously advanced by some historians in recent years, that she may have been a slave, a woman of Middle Eastern or North African origin, brought to Tuscany through the Mediterranean trade routes that moved enslaved people as freely as they moved cloth and spices. The evidence is circumstantial. Her name appears without a family surname in documents. She has no traceable local family. and a document that may refer to her describes a woman of foreign origin. The debate remains open. What is certain is that she is not married to the child's father. His father is Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary, a respectable man of the professional class, educated, ambitious, well-connected. Ser Piero works in Florence, which is where the money and the opportunity are. He maintains the house in Vinci for his family, but his life is in the city, the child born between these two people, between the peasant and the notary, between the lower world and the respectable one, is Leonardo. He is illegitimate. In 15th century Italy, this is not a minor detail. It is a defining legal and social condition. Illegitimate children cannot hold public office. They cannot join guilds through the normal channels. They cannot inherit their father's property or title. They are, in the eyes of the law, partially invisible. What that means in practice, for the child who will grow up to be Leonardo da Vinci, is that he is freed from one path and forced to find another. He cannot follow his father into the notary profession. He cannot pursue the career paths that legitimate sons of the respectable class pursue. He has to be something else. And that necessity, which must have felt at times like a wound, turns out to be, in retrospect, one of the central conditions of his greatness. But before any of that, before Florence, before the workshops, before the notebooks, there is Vinci. Vinci is a small hill town in the Arno Valley, between Florence and the sea. It is not remarkable. It is the kind of place that exists in thousands of versions across Tuscany. A cluster of stone buildings on a ridge, olive trees on the slopes below, vineyards stretching toward the valley floor, the Arno winding through the distance like a silver thread. The land itself is worth describing, because Leonardo carries it with him for the rest of his life. The Arno Valley is a place of extraordinary variety within a small space. In the spring it is green and soft. In the summer, the hills turn brown, and the light is flat and intense. In the autumn, there is a quality of golden haze that painters have returned to for centuries trying to capture it. In the winter, the mountains to the north turn white, and the river swells in its banks. The weather comes in fast, over the Apennines, and you can watch a storm build on the horizon for an hour before it arrives. All of this enters the eyes of a child who cannot stop looking, and the notebooks he fills 60 years later, with their drawings of storms, their studies of light on water, their observations of how the color of the atmosphere changes with distance, are, in part, a lifelong conversation with the landscape of Tuscany that shaped his eye before he knew it was being shaped. For the first few years of his life, Leonardo lives with his mother, Caterina. Then, as often happened in cases like his, he is taken in by his father's family. Ser Piero da Vinci marries a woman of his own class, the first of 4 wives. And Leonardo is raised in his grandfather's house, in the care of his grandfather Antonio and his young uncle Francesco. Uncle Francesco is only 15 years older than Leonardo. In many ways, he is more like an older brother than an uncle. He has no particular ambition. He tends the land. He knows the name of every plant and insect in the valley. He takes walks that go nowhere in particular and last all afternoon. And it is Francesco who first takes the child out into the fields and hills around Vinci and shows him the world. Not as a collection of things to be named and cataloged, but as a living system of relationships. Water and soil and root and weather and light, all of it connected, all of it continuously moving and changing. This is where Leonardo's education begins. Not in a classroom, not with a book. Outside, he watches the way water moves in the irrigation channels that cross the valley. He studies the insects in the grass. He draws the shape of leaves, the curve of a hill. the way light changes on the surface of the Arno at different hours of the day. He brings home animals, lizards, frogs, small birds, and keeps them long enough to understand how they work before releasing them. He watches how a hawk holds still in the air against a headwind and thinks about that. He carries that question with him for weeks. There is a story told by Giorgio Vasari in his Lives of the Artists, written some decades after Leonardo's death, and therefore not fully reliable as a factual account, but almost certainly capturing something true in spirit, about the young Leonardo being asked by his father to paint a decorative shield for a local peasant. Leonardo takes the shield, goes to his room, and begins collecting specimens: lizards, grasshoppers, bats, snakes. He studies them carefully. He dissects some of them. He draws them repeatedly from different angles. Then, he uses everything he has observed to paint on the shield a single creature. A composite monster, assembled from the real parts of real animals, that is so naturalistic and so terrifying that when Ser Piero shows it to the peasant, the man falls backward in shock. The story may be embellished. The psychology is exact. Leonardo is not interested in inventing a monster. He is interested in understanding real things so thoroughly that he can synthesize them into something that has never existed. That process of deep observation followed by creative synthesis is the structure of everything he will ever do. There is something about this child that the people around him notice almost immediately. It is not simply that he draws well, although he does. It is the quality of his attention. He looks at things differently. He looks longer. He asks questions that have no obvious answers. Why does the bird flap its wings at the top of the stroke and not the bottom? Why does the water slow when the channel widens? Why does the flame of a candle always point upward, no matter which direction the wind blows from below? These are not casual questions. These are the questions of someone who genuinely cannot rest until he finds the answer. Most children are born curious. Most children learn, slowly and painfully, to suppress that curiosity in favor of the answers that adults and institutions prefer. Leonardo never learned this lesson. Or rather, and this is perhaps the more interesting explanation, he learned it but refused it. He saw the approved answers and kept asking anyway. His illegitimacy, which might have been simply a disadvantage in a more rigid family, becomes, in this household, a kind of freedom. He is not being prepared for a specific role. He is not being trained for the notary profession, which is what Ser Piero does, and which requires a specific kind of education oriented toward specific practical ends. He is, in a certain sense, unscheduled. His grandfather Antonio is old and gentle. His uncle Francesco is a dreamer who prefers the fields to any ambition. The household around the young Leonardo is one in which no one is particularly watching the clock, and this suits him entirely. He later writes, in his notebooks, about the experience of going alone into caves as a child. Dark openings in the hillside above Vinci, which drew him with what he describes as a combination of terror and desire. He stands at the entrance of the cave. He cannot see what is inside. Part of him wants to run. A stronger part wants to go in and see. He goes in. This is, he understands in retrospect, a description of how he approaches every problem he will ever face. The fear is real. The curiosity is stronger. When Leonardo is around 12 years old, he moves to Florence. The exact date is uncertain. What is certain is that his father, Ser Piero, by now an established notary in the city, recognizes something in his illegitimate son that he cannot ignore. The boy draws obsessively. He draws everything: rocks, rivers, faces, hands, flowers, storms. And what he produces is not the ordinary work of a child who has learned to copy things. It is something more. Ser Piero takes some of his son's drawings to a friend of his. That friend is Andrea del Verrocchio. And Verrocchio, one of the most accomplished artists in Florence, sculptor, painter, goldsmith, teacher, looks at the drawings and tells Ser Piero that this boy should be in his workshop immediately. Florence in the 1460s is, without any exaggeration, the most exciting city in the world. It is not the largest. It is not the most powerful militarily. But it is the place where something new is being invented, a way of seeing, a way of thinking, a way of making things that will eventually change everything. The Medici family controls the city. Not openly. There is still the form of a republic, still a council, still the pretense of democratic governance. But the Medici are the true center of gravity. Cosimo de' Medici, who died a few years before Leonardo arrives, built the library that would eventually house some of the most important manuscripts in Europe. His grandson Lorenzo, the boy who is about 10 years old when Leonardo arrives in Florence, and who will grow into one of the most remarkable men of the Renaissance, is already being shaped by the most sophisticated intellectual environment the Western world has produced since ancient Athens. The city's wealth comes from banking and cloth. But what that wealth pays for is extraordinary. Churches, palaces, sculptures, paintings, philosophical academies, libraries, musical performances, theatrical spectacles. And at the center of all this production are the workshops, the bodeghe, where things are actually made. In 15th century Florence, the workshop, the bottega, is not simply a place where things are made. It is a school, a laboratory, a community, a commercial enterprise, and a site of genuine intellectual life all at once. The master runs the business. He takes commissions. He oversees production. He teaches apprentices. And the apprentices, the young men who come to learn, do not simply learn to copy the master's style. They learn everything. They grind pigments. They prepare panels. They mix plaster. They study geometry. They learn to work with metal, wood, stone, leather. A good bottega produces not specialists, but complete artists. People who can do anything that a patron might ask. Verrocchio's bottega is one of the best in Florence. His clients include the Medici themselves. His workshop produces paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects for the most powerful families in Tuscany. And the young men he trains will go on to define an era. Among them, eventually, Perugino, Botticelli, and the boy from Vinci. Leonardo arrives as an apprentice, probably around 1464 or 1466. He is perhaps 12 or 14 years old. He begins at the bottom, as everyone does, cleaning, preparing materials, watching, copying. But almost from the beginning, it is clear that something is different about him. Verrocchio is not a modest man. He is confident in his abilities, and he is one of the best artists working in Italy. But the story that has come down to us, told first by the art historian Giorgio Vasari nearly a century later, is that at some point during their collaboration on a painting, the Baptism of Christ, Verrocchio asks Leonardo to paint one of the angels, and when he sees what Leonardo has done, Verrocchio puts down his brushes, not in defeat exactly, but in recognition. He knows immediately that the student has surpassed him, and rather than resist that recognition or hide from it, he honors it. He returns to sculpture, the medium where he still feels confident, and largely abandons painting. Whether or not every detail of that story is accurate, the painting exists. The Baptism of Christ, now in the Uffizi in Florence, shows an angel on the left side that is clearly different from everything around it. Different in quality, different in feeling, different in the depth of light in the eyes. Even if you know nothing about Renaissance painting, you can see that one figure does not belong to the same world as the others. It is more alive. It is present in a way that the other figures are not. Leonardo is in his late teens when he paints it. He has barely begun. What does he learn in Verrocchio's workshop? He learns everything. He learns to paint in tempera and in the newly arrived oil technique coming up from Flanders. He learns to sculpt in bronze and clay. He learns to work with machinery. Verrocchio has pulleys, winches, mechanical systems for lifting large sculptures. He learns to play music because music is considered part of the education of a complete artist. He learns geometry and the rigorous mathematical system of perspective that had been worked out by Brunelleschi earlier in the century and codified by the architect and writer Leon Battista Alberti into a set of rules that every serious artist now applies. Perspective is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is one of the intellectual achievements that makes the Florentine Renaissance genuinely revolutionary. Before perspective, painters represented space intuitively. Larger figures in the foreground, smaller ones in the background, but without a systematic mathematical relationship between size and distance. With perspective, a painter can create a mathematically accurate representation of three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Objects diminish in a predictable ratio as they recede. Lines converge at vanishing points. The surface of the painting becomes a window through which the viewer looks into an illusionistic space. Leonardo absorbs this system completely and then begins to question it. He notices that human vision does not actually work the way perspective assumes. We do not see with a single fixed eye at a single fixed point. We have two eyes. Our eyes move. The image our brain constructs from the information our eyes provide is not a geometric projection, but something more complicated. An assembly, a synthesis, a product of memory and expectation and attention, as much as of optical mechanics. He begins to think about what painting could achieve if it tried to represent not what the eye technically sees, but what the mind actually perceives. This thinking will eventually produce Sfumato, but that is still years away. In 1478, Leonardo was given his first independent commission, an altarpiece for the chapel of San Bernardo in the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of Florentine government. He receives an initial payment. He does not deliver the painting. There is no record of him ever beginning it seriously. This is the first clear instance of something that will repeat throughout his life. The commission exists. The payment is made. The work is not produced. It is not that Leonardo is lazy. It is that his attention has moved. Something else has captured him. And once his attention has moved, it is very difficult to bring it back. 1478 is also the year of the Pazzi conspiracy, the attempt to assassinate the Medici brothers during a church service. Giuliano de' Medici is stabbed 19 times and dies before the altar. Lorenzo escapes wounded through a side door. The city erupts in violence. The conspirators are hunted down. Some are hanged. Some are killed in the streets. Leonardo draws the hanging bodies. With the precision of a journalist and the detachment of a scientist, he sketches one of the executed conspirators, noting the angle of the head, the color of the clothing, the exact position of the bound hands, the number of steps below the window where the body swings. He is not documenting horror. He is observing human anatomy under unusual conditions. He is doing what he always does, looking. This will strike some people as cold, but it is, in a sense, the most human thing about him. He cannot turn his gaze away from what is actually there. The late 1470s and early 1480s are a period of restlessness for Leonardo. He has outgrown Verrocchio's workshop in every meaningful sense. He is an independent artist, registered with the Painters Guild, capable of taking his own commissions and directing his own work. But Florence, for all its intellectual richness, is a city where he feels increasingly constrained. Part of the constraint is practical. The Florentine art world is organized around established relationships between families and workshops, between patrons and trusted artists who have served them for years. Leonardo is not part of these networks in the way that a legitimate son of the right family would be. His illegitimacy, which placed him outside certain doors, is still a factor. But there is something more personal operating as well. Leonardo is beginning to understand, in this period, just how different his actual interests are from those of a conventional painter. He is spending more time on geometry than on painting. He is dissecting animals, birds and dogs and various other creatures, to understand how they are put together from the inside. He is filling pages with drawings of water and rocks and plants that are not preparatory studies for any painting, but simply the products of a mind with no off switch. He starts several major works during this period. The Adoration of the Magi, commissioned by a monastery in 1481, is one. He begins it. The preparatory work is extraordinary. Intricate compositional drawings, studies of individual figures, the overall spatial arrangement. And then he abandons it. He leaves Florence without finishing it. The unfinished panel will sit in the monastery for years, then move through various collections, and eventually end up in the Uffizi, where it hangs today as one of the most remarkable unfinished works in the history of painting. Looking at the Adoration now, you can see exactly why Leonardo could not finish it. The composition is too full of problems. Not technical problems, he can solve those, but conceptual problems. Questions about how to represent the relationship between the Christ child and the crowd of figures pressing toward him. Questions about the spatial logic of the scene. Questions that each new solution generates further questions. He could have painted over those questions and produced something satisfactory. Instead, he went somewhere else. He goes to Milan. Before he leaves, he writes a letter. This letter, or rather a draft of it, which was preserved among his papers, is one of the most revealing documents he ever produced. It is addressed to Ludovico Sforza, the de facto ruler of Milan. And in it, Leonardo does something extraordinary. He reinvents himself completely. He does not present himself as the most talented painter in Italy, which he probably is. He presents himself as a military engineer. He can design portable bridges for rapid deployment in the field. He can build tunnels for secret troop movements. He can design artillery. He can construct armored wagons that move through enemy lines. He can design ships. He can build siege machinery. He can drain the moats around enemy fortifications. And in times of peace, he adds, almost as a footnote at the end, he can also create paintings and sculpture, and he might be able to complete the bronze equestrian statue of Francesco Sforza that Ludovico's father had once commissioned and that has never been built. The letter is a masterpiece of strategic self-presentation. Leonardo understands with clarity what Ludovico needs. Ludovico is not a Medici. He is not a philosopher patron primarily interested in beauty and ideas. He is a warlord who has taken power through force and holds it through force in a political environment where military strength is the first and most important currency. He needs engineers. He needs people who can solve problems of war. So Leonardo becomes an engineer. Not falsely. The designs he offers are real, drawn from genuine thinking about mechanical problems. But he leads with what the patron needs to hear and places his paintings last, as if they were a minor afterthought. He is 30 years old. He is leaving everything he knows. And he has never, as far as we know, done serious military engineering in his life. He arrives in Milan in 1482 with his lyre, his notebooks, his unfinished paintings, and everything he has been thinking about for the last decade. Milan in 1482 is a city built on military power. The Sforza family, who have ruled it for a generation, are soldiers who became lords. Ludovico, known as Il Moro, the Moor, because of his dark complexion, is brilliant, calculating, deeply suspicious, and politically paranoid. He is not yet the official ruler of Milan when Leonardo arrives. He rules as regent for his young nephew Gian Galeazzo, whom he has effectively displaced. He is, by any measure, a ruthless man. He is also, perhaps unintentionally, the best patron Leonardo will ever have, not because Ludovico particularly understands what Leonardo is doing. He probably does not, in any deep sense, but because he gives Leonardo something more valuable than any specific commission. He gives him time, a salary, a house, a position at court that does not depend on the delivery of any specific object. For 17 years, Leonardo is attached to the Sforza court in Milan, and in those 17 years, he does things that no one else on earth is doing. The court itself is a world quite different from Florence. Milan's wealth comes not from banking and philosophy, but from manufacturing, trade, and military strength. The city produces armor, weapons, silk, and agricultural machinery. Its canals, an intricate network that Leonardo will examine with tireless precision, irrigate thousands of hectares and transport goods across the Lombardy plain. The culture is less philosophical than Florence, but in some ways more practical, more interested in how things actually work. This suits Leonardo perfectly. At the Sforza court, he is valued for his music first. He plays the lyre, an instrument he has mastered, and which he brings with him in a case of his own design. A silver instrument shaped like a horse's skull that produces a stronger, more resonant sound than conventional instruments. He performs at court entertainments. He designs theatrical spectacles, the elaborate pageants and celebrations that the Sforza court stages to display its power and sophistication. He designs sets that include moving mechanical elements, revolving stages, rising figures, astronomical models with moving planetary spheres. He is, in the early Milan years, something between a court entertainer and a creative director. But behind the performances, the notebooks are filling up. The notebooks of the Milan period represent an explosion of intellectual activity that is almost impossible to fully comprehend even when you have read them. Leonardo is thinking about everything simultaneously, and the notebooks show the surface of that thinking, a surface that changes from page to page, sometimes within a single page. On one page, he draws a gear mechanism. On the next, a human skull with the cranial bones peeled back to show the brain cavity. 3 pages later, a detailed study of the way a river bends, with notes about how the water moves faster on the outside of the curve and deposits sediment on the inside, a principle not formalized in hydraulics until centuries later. After that, a design for a canal lock, then a diagram of the eye with the optic nerves shown entering the brain, then the text of a fable he is composing, then a shopping list. The fables deserve a mention, because they are almost never discussed in accounts of Leonardo's life, and they are revealing. He writes dozens of them. Short, sharp parables involving animals, often with a moral at the end, but sometimes without. They are not childlike. They are the productions of a mind that thinks naturally in image and story. that understands how to compress a complex observation into a form that the ear can catch and hold. He is, among everything else, a natural writer, someone for whom language comes easily and vividly. The notebooks are written in mirror script, from right to left across the page, so that they read correctly only in a mirror. He is left-handed, and this direction prevents smearing. But there may be another dimension to it. The mirror script means that someone idly picking up his notebook cannot read it easily. There is a quality of privacy, of enclosure to these pages. He is not writing for an audience. He is thinking out loud in the most private possible way. In the late 1480s and early 1490s, the anatomical work intensifies. He gains access to cadavers through the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, and later, through hospitals in Milan. He dissects human bodies, old men, infants, people who died of different causes, with systematic thoroughness. He dissects animals simultaneously, comparing structures, looking for the principles common to all living things. The drawings that emerge from these dissections are technically and artistically extraordinary. He draws the skull from 3 angles simultaneously, a technique that anticipates modern medical illustration. He draws the bones of the hand with such precision that modern anatomists have used his drawings to teach. He draws the heart. And here, his observations push beyond anything his contemporaries understand. He sees that the aortic valve, the valve that controls blood flow from the heart into the aorta, opens and closes in a way that simple pressure cannot explain. He builds a glass model of the aortic root and uses water mixed with grass seeds to trace the flow of fluid through it. He sees the vortices that form in the sinuses above the valve, small pockets of recirculating fluid that push the valve leaflets gently closed as the flow reverses. He draws these vortices accurately. He understands that they are what makes the valve work. He writes about this with evident satisfaction, as someone who has solved a beautiful problem. This discovery, the role of aortic sinus vortices in valve closure, was not confirmed by modern cardiology until 1969, when researchers used techniques remarkably similar to Leonardo's glass model experiments to demonstrate it. The paper was published in Nature. The authors cited Leonardo. He is doing this in the 1490s, without a laboratory, without a research institution, without anyone to check his work or build on it. He puts the drawings in a notebook, covers them with more drawings, and moves on to the next question. But the anatomical work, as extraordinary as it is only one current in a river that flows in many directions simultaneously. The notebooks of the Milan period also contain, in extraordinary density, Leonardo's thinking about flight. Flight is perhaps the most romantic of Leonardo's obsessions, and the one that has most captured the popular imagination. The image of Leonardo inventing the airplane 500 years before the Wright brothers is irresistible, and it is not entirely wrong. But it needs to be understood correctly. Leonardo does not simply sketch fanciful winged machines and hope that someday someone will build them. He approaches the problem of flight the way he approaches every problem, by understanding it from the ground up, beginning with what actually flies. He studies birds with the same systematic intensity he brings to human anatomy. He watches them not merely to admire them, but to understand the mechanics of what they do. How the primary feathers at the wingtip spread on the downstroke and close on the upstroke. How the tail adjusts constantly to maintain balance. How a large bird, a kite, a heron, an eagle, can remain motionless in a headwind without flapping, simply by adjusting the angle of its wings against the moving air. He notes that birds rarely flap continuously. They glide. They use the air itself as a medium to move through, exploiting differences in pressure and the rising currents of warm air from the ground. This observation leads him to something fundamental. A bird does not fly by pushing down against the air with flat wings. A bird flies because its wings are curved, thicker at the front, tapering toward the back. And this curvature creates a difference in the speed of air flowing over the top and bottom surfaces. Air moves faster over the curved upper surface, creating lower pressure above the wing than below it. This difference in pressure produces lift. The wing, in effect, is pulled upward, not pushed. He does not have the mathematical formalism to express this precisely, but he understands it. He draws it. He describes it in terms of the behavior of air and the shape of the wing, with an accuracy that will not be formalized until Bernoulli, 200 years later. His early machine designs are ornithopters, machines that flap their wings, powered by the pilot's legs and arms. He designed several of these, with increasing mechanical sophistication. The pilot lies face down on a central structure with the wings above. Leg-operated cranks drive the main downstroke. Arm-operated levers control the smaller adjustments. The wings are covered in a membrane of starch taffeta or linen, which he calculates will be light enough and strong enough for the purpose. He also designs the mechanism for testing the wings, a system of ropes and counterweights that allows the wing mechanism to be tested without the full weight of the machine, to verify that the mechanism actually generates lift before the complete structure is committed. He is thinking like an engineer. He is testing his assumptions before committing to full-scale construction. The ornithopter designs have a problem that Leonardo eventually recognizes. Human muscles cannot generate enough power per unit of body weight to sustain flapping flight. Birds are able to fly, not because their muscles are strong relative to ours. They are not, in absolute terms, but because their bodies are optimized for flight in ways that a human body cannot replicate. Their bones are hollow, their muscles are proportioned differently, their hearts are faster. Their entire metabolism is calibrated for the enormous energy demands of flight. A human-powered ornithopter cannot fly. This is not a failure of engineering. It is a physical fact. Leonardo does not fully articulate this conclusion in his notebooks. He keeps returning to ornithopter designs through several decades, always refining. But his thinking gradually shifts. By the later Milan period, the designs begin to include what look more like gliders, structures intended not to generate lift by flapping, but to use existing air currents, the way a large bird soars. He also designs, in a small drawing that is easy to overlook among the thousands of pages, what he calls the aerial screw. It is a helix, a large rotating screw shape, driven by a mechanism that he believes will drill itself upward through the air, the way a screw drills into wood. The sketch is rough. The engineering details are incomplete, but the concept, a rotating blade that generates vertical thrust by pushing down against air, is the concept underlying the helicopter, which will not be successfully built for another 450 years. He also designs a parachute, a pyramidal structure of wood and cloth, 14 braccia across, roughly 9 meters, that he calculates will slow a falling body enough to allow survival from any height. The design was tested in the year 2000, when a British skydiver named Adrian Nicholas constructed a replica from Leonardo's specifications and jumped from a hot air balloon at 10,000 feet. It worked. Leonardo's calculation was correct. These things, the parachute that works, the aerial screw that anticipates the helicopter, the lift theory that anticipates Bernoulli, are not coincidences. They are the products of a method. The method is, go back to first principles. Observe what actually happens rather than what theory predicts. and follow the logic wherever it leads without worrying about whether the destination is respectable or achievable in your own lifetime. Among the projects that occupy Leonardo during the Milan years, none is more emblematic of his particular genius and his particular failure than the equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza. Ludovico wants to commemorate his father with the greatest equestrian statue ever made. He gives the commission to Leonardo. The proposed statue will be enormous, over 7 meters tall, the largest bronze horse ever cast. The project is, in every sense, a monument to impossibility. Leonardo studies horses. This is perhaps too mild a way to put it. He is consumed by horses. He visits the stables of the Sforza court repeatedly, not to sketch them picturesquely as other artists might, but to measure them. He measures the proportions of individual horses the way a scientist measures a specimen. The circumference of the leg at different points, the angle of the shoulder, the relationship between the length of the neck and the height of the withers. He draws horses walking, trotting, galloping, rearing. He draws the musculature in layers, first the skeleton, then the major muscle groups, then the surface. He draws them from above, from below, from the front, from behind. He is trying to understand, in the deepest possible sense, what a horse is. Not its appearance, but its structure. The engineering behind the form. The preliminary design goes through several phases. He first conceives the horse rearing, a dramatic, dynamic pose, the front legs raised, the whole figure in motion. But a rearing horse presents technical problems of extreme difficulty for a bronze casting. The weight of the metal needs to be supported by the hind legs alone, which requires engineering solutions that are well beyond standard practice. He redesigns. The final model shows the horse in a more contained movement, still vital, still suggesting power, but with a different distribution of mass. By 1493, the clay model is ready. It is enormous. When it is displayed in the courtyard of the Sforza castle for the wedding of Ludovico's niece to the Holy Roman Emperor, the response is overwhelming. Poets write about it. Artists come from across Italy to see it. A Florentine sculptor who visits writes back to Lorenzo de' Medici, describing a thing of extraordinary beauty. Unlike any equestrian statue ever made, the bronze is never poured. The reason is war. In 1494, the French King Charles VIII invades Italy, triggering a cascade of conflicts that will keep the Italian peninsula in crisis for decades. Ludovico Sforza, who has been playing a dangerous game of diplomatic alliances, finds himself suddenly vulnerable. He needs artillery. He needs metal for cannons. The 75 tons of bronze earmarked for Leonardo's horse is redirected. Leonardo makes a note in his notebooks. He records the situation without evident bitterness. He is disappointed. That much is clear from the brevity of the entry. But he does not dwell. He moves on. The clay model deteriorates. When the French soldiers arrive in Milan in 1499, they use it for target practice. The soldiers have crossbows, and they are bored. The greatest equestrian monument of the Renaissance is reduced to rubble by people who have no idea what they are destroying. During these same years, Leonardo's domestic life in Milan takes on a shape that will persist for decades. In 1490, he takes on a new apprentice. The boy is 10 years old, the son of a poor family. His name is Gian Giacomo Caprotti. Leonardo renames him Salai, a word from Milanese dialect that means something roughly equivalent to little devil or imp. The name sticks. Salai is, by Leonardo's own written account, a disaster as an apprentice and an inexhaustible source of exasperation. Leonardo keeps a careful record. In the first year, Salai steals money from Leonardo's purse, 5 times Leonardo notes. He steals a silver drawing instrument. He lies about it. He eats more than 3 people. He destroys things. He is charming, beautiful, and fundamentally unreliable. Leonardo does not dismiss him. He keeps him for 30 years. What to make of this relationship has occupied historians for a long time. Leonardo writes about Salai with something that reads, in its very irritation and detail, like love. He commissions expensive clothing for him, silk, velvet, decorated boots, clothing that Leonardo himself never wears. He catalogues his offenses the way someone catalogues the small outrages of a person whose company they cannot give up. He paints him, probably. Several works show a young man with Salai's features, including a figure in some versions of the Virgin of the Rocks. He also paints the Virgin of the Rocks in its first version during this period, probably in the early 1480s, shortly after his arrival in Milan. The painting is commissioned by a religious confraternity for their chapel, with detailed specifications about the figures it should include. Leonardo delivers something that technically fulfills the brief, but is so thoroughly his own vision that the confraternity is unhappy. They want the figures clearly identifiable, halos visible, the devotional purpose unmistakable. Leonardo has given them a cave full of mysterious light, a painting that feels more like a dream than a devotional image. There is a dispute about payment that lasts for years. A second version is eventually produced, probably with significant studio assistance. And the original Louvre version ends up with someone else, then moves through the French royal collection. The story is complicated and still not fully resolved, but the painting itself is, in any assessment, one of the most remarkable works of the entire Renaissance. In the middle of the Milan years, Leonardo receives the commission that will produce his most ambitious painting. Not the Mona Lisa, that is still years away. The Last Supper. The commission comes from Ludovico Sforza himself, who wants a mural for the refectory, the dining hall, of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie. Ludovico has adopted this church as a kind of Sforza dynastic monument. He plans to be buried there. He wants the decoration of the refectory to reflect the greatness of his court. Leonardo begins work around 1495. He will spend 3 years on it. The technique he chooses is, as we have already noted, not traditional fresco. Traditional fresco requires you to work fast, to apply pigment to wet plaster in sections, completing each section before the plaster dries and the paint bonds permanently. It produces durable results, resistant to time and moisture. Michelangelo will use it for the Sistine Chapel a decade later, painting at a pace that seems superhuman precisely because the technique demands it. Leonardo cannot work that way. He is constitutionally incapable of it. Instead, he applies a dry plaster ground, a mixture of gesso, pitch, and mastic, to the wall, and paints on top of it in tempera and oil. This gives him what he needs: the ability to return to a passage after days or weeks, to look at it again, to change it, to refine it. He can spend a morning looking at the face of Judas and not touch it, then come back the following week and make one small adjustment that changes everything. The prior of the convent finds this maddening. He complains to Ludovico that Leonardo is not working. Ludovico, to his credit, understands enough about how his painter works to back him. Leonardo explains, when asked, that the creative process is not continuous labor, that there are periods when a painter must not paint, must simply look and think, and let the image develop in his mind until it is ready to be committed to the surface. He suggests, with what may be gentle humor, that if he cannot find a suitable face for Judas anywhere else, he will use the priors. The composition Leonardo arrives at is, by any measure, a breakthrough. The scene is the moment Christ says, "One of you will betray me," not the institution of the Eucharist, which is where earlier depictions had typically focused. Leonardo chooses the instant of maximum psychological drama, the moment when the words land, when each of the 12 men around the table is confronted with something unexpected, something that requires a response, and each one responds differently. Leonardo groups the apostles in sets of 3, 4 groups of 3 balanced around the central figure of Christ. Each group has its own internal dynamic. Each individual figure within each group is having a specific, psychologically distinct reaction. Peter leans forward aggressively, gripping a knife. John, young and gentle, seems to swoon. Thomas raises one finger as if demanding clarification. James the elder spreads his arms wide in shock. Judas, differentiated from the others not by position alone, but by the angle of his shadow and the small bag of coins he grips, is the only one who does not reach toward Christ or pull back from him. He pulls away from the table, into himself, into guilt. And in the center, Christ, calm, resigned, the hands open, palms up, in a gesture that could be offering or farewell. The face, even now, even through 500 years of damage and repainting, has a quality of stillness that is almost unbearable. No painting before it has done this, has used the faces and bodies of so many figures simultaneously to create a single, unified psychological moment. It is, among other things, a work of empathy of a very high order. To paint 12 different responses to the same words, Leonardo has had to imagine himself inside 12 different men, feeling what they feel, thinking what they think. The psychological intelligence required is as extraordinary as the technical achievement. The prior of the monastery gets his painting. He's not grateful. He is confused. He wanted a devotional image. He got something else, something that is clearly more than devotional without being anything he has a word for. When it is finished in 1498, the Last Supper is immediately recognized as something unprecedented. People come from across Italy and beyond to see it. A Dominican friar who sees it shortly after its completion writes that it beggars all description. The Milanese consider it a treasure beyond price. Then, in October 1499, everything changes. The French army marches into Milan. Louis XII, who has a dynastic claim to the duchy, has spent 2 years preparing this campaign. Ludovico Sforza, who overestimated his alliances and underestimated French resolve, finds himself abandoned. He flees. He will be captured the following year, imprisoned in a French dungeon, and die there in 1508. A cautionary tale about how quickly fortune turns. Leonardo watches from a distance. He has already begun to move. His salary has stopped. The court that sustained him for 17 years has dissolved overnight. He is 47 years old, and the world he built his life around has simply disappeared. He packs his notebooks, his tools, his paintings, and he leaves Milan in December 1499. The 7 years that follow are the most turbulent of Leonardo's life. They are years of movement, of repeated displacement, of searching for stability in a peninsula convulsed by war and political upheaval. From Milan, he goes first to Mantua, where he spends a few weeks at the court of Isabella d'Este. Isabella is among the most cultivated women of the Renaissance, educated, sophisticated, a serious collector of art and antiquities. Someone who corresponds with the leading minds of her era as a matter of intellectual pleasure. She wants Leonardo to paint her portrait. He makes a preparatory drawing, a profile sketch in chalk that is now in the Louvre, and that is itself beautiful enough to make the loss of the finished painting a genuine grief. He promises to complete the work. He leaves. He never sends it. Isabella writes to him repeatedly over the following years, first requesting, then asking, then gently pressing. He responds vaguely or not at all. The portrait is never made. Isabella eventually accepts this with what appears to be genuine philosophical resignation, though the correspondence suggests she was more wounded by it than she let on. She collects paintings by the greatest artists of her age. She cannot get one from Leonardo, because Leonardo cannot be obtained. He can only be encountered. From Mantua, he goes to Venice, where he briefly works on defensive proposals for the Republic, worried about potential Ottoman attacks from the east. He proposes flooding the Isonzo Valley as a military barrier, a genuinely creative solution to a real military problem, though it is never implemented. He studies the Venetian hydraulic systems, the lagoon, the way the city manages its relationship with water. More notebook pages. Then, in the spring of 1500, he returns to Florence. He has not lived in Florence for 18 years. The city has changed enormously. The Medici have been expelled. Savonarola, the charismatic, terrifying Dominican friar who seized the city's spiritual imagination after the Medici fell, has been burned at the stake. Florence is a republic again, governing itself through a complex and not entirely functional set of councils and committees. It is, in 1500, a city between identities. No longer the brilliant Medici court, not yet anything else. And there is a new presence in the city. A young man from Caprese, recently returned from Rome, who has completed a marble Pietà for St. Peter's that has stunned everyone who has seen it. His name is Michelangelo Buonarroti, and he is 24 years old. The relationship between Leonardo and Michelangelo is one of the most interesting and most uncomfortable in the history of art. They are the two greatest artists of their era. They dislike each other thoroughly. Leonardo is 47, elegant, private, skeptical, interested in everything. Michelangelo is 24, volcanic, intensely religious, fiercely committed to a single vision, openly contemptuous of other approaches. He considers painting inferior to sculpture. He considers Leonardo's habit of not finishing things a moral failure. He says so publicly, or nearly. Leonardo regards Michelangelo's intensity as a kind of barbarism. Someone who works like a man in pain, who cannot find the grace that makes great art feel inevitable rather than wrenched. There is a story, possibly true, of Leonardo passing through a group of men discussing a passage from Dante, and one of the men calling out to him to explain it. Leonardo points to Michelangelo, who is nearby. Michelangelo, hearing this, responds with contempt. Something sharp and dismissive about Leonardo's famous unfinished horse. The exchange ends there, but the hostility it reveals is real. They are required in 1503 to work in the same building. The Florentine government commissions them both to paint murals in the council hall of the Palazzo della Signoria, the new hall of the Great Council, where Florence's republican government meets. Leonardo is assigned one wall, the Battle of Anghiari, a Florentine military victory from 1440. Michelangelo is assigned the opposite wall, the Battle of Cassina, another Florentine triumph. The project would have been the greatest artistic confrontation in history, made physically manifest in the same room. Two opposite walls, two opposite visions of what painting can do. Neither painting is completed. Leonardo works on preparatory cartoons, full-scale drawings that would be transferred to the wall as the basis for the fresco. His cartoons for the Battle of Anghiari are extraordinary. The central scene, a knot of men and horses fighting over a military standard, is violent, chaotic, and psychologically precise in a way that nothing before it achieves. Horses scream, men bite each other. The fury of combat is rendered not as heroism, but as animal intensity. He begins transferring the design to the wall using a new technique, heating the surface to fix the paint. And the first section runs. It does not work. He stops. He never returns to it. The wall remains unfinished. The cartoons, passed around and copied endlessly by other artists, eventually disappear. What survives are copies of copies, enough to understand what was planned, not enough to feel what it would have been. During these Florence years, while the council hall project slowly comes apart, something else is happening. Something quieter. Something that will, in the end, prove to be the most important work of his life. He is painting the Mona Lisa. It probably begins around 1503. The generally accepted account is that the sitter is Lisa Gherardini, wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo, who commissioned the portrait perhaps to mark the birth of their second son, perhaps as a celebration of their new house. In Italian, the painting is known as La Gioconda. In French, the language through which most of the world eventually came to know it, it becomes La Joconde. Francesco del Giocondo never receives it. Leonardo does not deliver the painting. He takes it with him when he leaves Florence in 1506. He carries it through the remaining years of his life. To Milan, to Rome, to France. He works on it intermittently for years, possibly decades. When he dies in 1519, it is still with him. The King of France acquires it shortly after, and it enters the French royal collection. 4 centuries later, it hangs in the Louvre behind bulletproof glass, surrounded on any given day by thousands of people trying to see it over each other's shoulders. Why does Leonardo keep it? The question is not trivial. He is, in practical terms, withholding a commissioned portrait from its commissioner. He is doing to Francesco del Giocondo exactly what he has done to dozens of other patrons, failing to deliver. But with the Mona Lisa, there seems to be something more specific operating. The painting is, for him, an ongoing experiment, a surface on which he is testing and refining ideas about how paint and light and psychology interact. He is not finished with it because he has not yet finished the thinking that it requires. And perhaps, too, because finishing it would mean it could leave his hands. And he cannot let it go. The technique deployed in the Mona Lisa is sfumato brought to its absolute extreme. There is not a single sharp edge in the face. Every transition between light and shadow is so gradual, so perfectly modulated, that the face seems to shift as you look at it. The expression changing slightly depending on where your eye focuses, the mood altering with the angle of view. The landscape behind her is similarly treated. Dreamlike, geologically impossible, the kind of landscape that exists in memory rather than in any real place. She looks at you. She has been looking at everyone who has stood before her for 500 years, and no one has entirely agreed on what the look means. In 1506, Leonardo returns to Milan. The French, who now govern the city, welcome him warmly. The new governor, Charles d'Amboise, becomes a genuine admirer and a more relaxed patron than Ludovico. Interested in having Leonardo near, less focused on what he is actually producing. Leonardo is 54 years old. He has behind him a career that is, by any objective measure, already among the greatest in the history of art. He has the Virgin of the Rocks, the Last Supper, the Mona Lisa in progress. He has the notebooks, thousands of pages of observations, designs, theories. He has the reputation of the greatest painter alive, even if much of his work has never been publicly exhibited. But he is not done. He is, in some essential sense, just beginning. The second Milan period is the most concentrated period of scientific investigation of his life. The anatomical work, which he has been doing in various forms for 30 years, now becomes the central project. He is working in a systematic way for the first time, with a clear idea of what a complete anatomical treatise would look like, and a genuine determination to produce it. He gains access through the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, and later through connections in Milan, to a steady supply of cadavers. He dissects human bodies, dozens of them, of different ages and sexes, with a thoroughness that goes beyond anything any contemporary is attempting. He dissects the same body part from multiple specimens, noting variations. He dissects at different stages of preparation, looking at fresh tissue and at dried specimens. He uses wax injections to map the internal chambers of the brain and the ventricles of the heart, a technique that will not be widely used in anatomy until the 17th century. The drawings that result from this work are, in the plainest terms, masterpieces. They are also, by any technical standard, the most accurate anatomical illustrations made up to that point in human history. And some of them, the drawings of the spine, the shoulder, the proportional relationships of the skeleton, would not be significantly surpassed until the 19th century. What Leonardo discovers in these dissections goes beyond accurate representation. He discovers the precise geometry of the aortic valve and the role of the sinus vortices in its closure, as we have already mentioned. He discovers that hardening of the arteries, what we now call arteriosclerosis, is a distinct pathological process, not simply aging. He observes it in the arteries of a man he describes as being over 100 years old, who died in his presence in the hospital, and whose body he examines shortly after death. He notes the difference between the arteries of this old man and those of a young child he has also dissected, and he draws conclusions about the progressive narrowing and thickening of arterial walls that modern cardiology confirms completely. He discovers the mechanics of the human eye with a precision that allows him to describe correctly how light focuses on the retina and how the image formed there is inverted, and then to pose the question of how the brain corrects for this inversion, a question that neuroscience is still, in certain respects, working on. He draws the fetus in the womb. The drawing, the famous image of the curled fetus inside the opened uterus, surrounded by smaller diagrams of the umbilicus and the placental structure, is not only scientifically accurate, but one of the most tender images he ever produced. The fetus curled in its sac is simultaneously a specimen and a person. The scientific and the human are not in conflict in this drawing. They complete each other. And through all of this work, the question of publication haunts him. He writes in the notebooks that he intends to prepare a complete treatise on human anatomy. He describes the structure of it. He imagines the audience, students of medicine, scholars, artists who want to understand the body from the inside. He knows that what he has produced, taken together, would transform medical understanding. He never publishes it. The reasons are multiple and not entirely clear, even from the notebooks. The work is never quite complete. There are always more specimens to examine, more questions that the last answer has generated. The process of preparing a text for publication, organizing, editing, explaining, choosing which illustrations to include, requires a kind of sustained, linear commitment that Leonardo's mind resists. He can think endlessly. He cannot quite stop thinking long enough to write down what he has concluded. There is also, in this period, an incident with the church that may have given him reason for caution. A German mirror maker at the Belvedere court in Rome, a man Leonardo distrusts and argues with, reportedly tells a church authority that Leonardo is engaging in necromancy, or worse, in the dissection of bodies in ways that the church finds disturbing. The accusation is probably motivated by personal animosity, but it is enough to cause the hospital to withdraw permission for further dissections. This happens during the Rome years, slightly later, but it casts a shadow back over the Milan work as well. He knows that what he is doing is not officially prohibited, but he also knows that it is not encouraged, and that the line between acceptable scholarship and dangerous transgression is not always clearly drawn. In 1513, Giuliano de' Medici, brother of Pope Leo X, and Leonardo's main contact with the new Medici power structure, invites him to Rome. Leonardo leaves Milan again, packing the notebooks again, moving again toward the next patron and the next possibility. Rome, in 1513, is not the city Leonardo left in 1499. It has been transformed, almost unrecognizably, by 15 years of Vatican patronage. The popes who have held office in that period, Julius II in particular, the warrior pope, the builder, have turned Rome into the greatest construction site in the world. The old Basilica of St. Peter is being torn down and replaced with something that will be, when finished, the largest church ever built. The papal apartments in the Vatican have been decorated by a young man from Urbino, Raffaello Sanzio, known as Raphael, whose frescoes have established a standard of technical accomplishment and serene beauty that defines the era. Michelangelo has just finished 4 years of agonizing work on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The frescoes, covering some 500 square meters of barrel-vaulted surface with scenes from Genesis, surrounded by prophets and sibyls, and the famous ignudi, the naked youths who frame the central panels, are, by general consensus among those who have seen them, unlike anything that has been made before. They are also, by Michelangelo's own account, made in conditions of terrible physical hardship. Lying on his back on scaffolding, working upside down, painting with plaster dripping into his face, fighting with Julius II over payment and timelines. Into this world of enormous achievement, enormous ambition, and enormous competitive intensity, comes Leonardo da Vinci, 61 years old, accompanied by Melzi and a small household. He is given comfortable rooms in the Belvedere. He has a salary from Giuliano de' Medici. He has resources, assistants, everything he needs to work. He begins several projects, as always. He thinks about a new church design. He continues the notebooks, geology, optics, geometry. He visits the hospital of Santo Spirito and performs a few more dissections. Then someone reports him to the church, and the dissections stop. He is isolated in a way he has not been before. The city is dominated by 2 artists a generation younger than him, Raphael and Michelangelo, who are producing work at a rate and on a scale that Leonardo cannot match. He is not competing with them in any direct sense. He is simply present alongside them, and the comparison, which everyone around him is making whether they say so or not, is not comfortable. A famous story from this period. Leo X gives Leonardo a small commission, a painting. Leonardo begins by preparing his own varnish for the finished surface, working on the chemistry of the finish before the painting itself exists. The Pope hears about this. He makes a remark. This man will never finish anything. He is thinking about the end before he has thought about the beginning. The remark is not entirely fair. Leonardo's habit of exploring the conditions of a problem before addressing the problem itself is, in fact, a sophisticated approach, one that engineers and scientists now recognize as intelligent project design. But it looks, from the outside, and especially to a patron who wants results, like procrastination of a particularly maddening kind. Rome does not work for Leonardo. He is too old, or too settled in his ways, or simply too different from what the city needs in this particular moment. He continues to fill pages with thoughts, extraordinary pages still, on the formation of waves, the behavior of light in transparent materials, the mathematical properties of curved surfaces. He makes friends. He explores the ruins of ancient Rome with a curiosity that is not merely aesthetic, but structural. He wants to understand how the Romans built, what their engineering principles were, how they solved the problem of the arch and the dome. But the creative electricity that crackled through the Milan years is not present here. He is working, but he is not on fire. In 1516, his situation changes definitively. Giuliano de' Medici dies. Leo X, now facing the initial tremors of the Reformation, Martin Luther has posted his theses in Wittenberg that same year, an event whose consequences will take decades to fully unfold, has little attention to spare for an aging Florentine painter who cannot complete a commission. And then a letter arrives from France. Francis I becomes King of France in January 1515 at 21 years old. He is physically remarkable, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of effortless physical presence that the Renaissance associated with power. He is also, genuinely and deeply, in love with Italian culture. He has fought in Italy. He has seen the art and architecture and intellectual life of the peninsula at close range. He has returned to France, wanting to bring something of it home, not as trophies, but as a living presence. He wants Italian artists at his court. He wants Italian ideas. He wants the feeling of Florence and Milan and Rome to somehow take root north of the Alps, in the Loire Valley, in the chateaux that line the river like a string of beautiful and impractical stones. His offer to Leonardo is the most generous an artist has ever received. A house in Amboise in the Loire Valley, a substantial annual salary, the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the King of France, complete freedom to do whatever he chooses, no specific commission, no deadline, no expectation of delivery, just the presence of Leonardo at the French court, available to talk, to think, to be what he is. Leonardo accepts. He is 64 years old. He packs the notebooks, thousands of pages, packs the paintings, including the Mona Lisa and the St. John the Baptist, says farewell to Salai, who will remain in Milan, and crosses the Alps for the last time in the autumn of 1516, accompanied by Melzi and a small household. The journey across the Alps is, for a 64-year-old man in uncertain health, a serious undertaking. The passes are cold in autumn. The roads are difficult. Leonardo travels slowly, but he makes it. And in the early winter of 1516, he arrives at the Château de Clos-Lucé in Amboise, a small manor house in the Loire Valley, connected to the royal residence at Amboise by an underground passage, comfortable and private, with gardens and a small stream visible from the windows. This is where he will spend the rest of his life. Francis visits almost daily. This is not an exaggeration or a sentimental embellishment. The King of France rearranges his schedule to spend time with Leonardo. He comes through the underground passage, which still exists, and which visitors to the chateau can walk through today, and sits with the old painter for hours. They talk about everything: engineering, philosophy, the nature of water and clouds, the future of French architecture, the ancient Romans, the experience of painting, the question of what beauty is and where it comes from. Francis later says that he does not believe any other man has ever been born who knew as much as Leonardo. Not just in painting, sculpture, and architecture, he specifies. In philosophy, it is, perhaps, the most accurate description anyone gives of Leonardo in his own lifetime. and it comes from a king who had no reason to flatter him. Leonardo, for his part, is genuinely happy in France. The anxiety of Rome, the feeling of being marginal, of being somewhere he does not quite fit, is gone. He has a patron who wants exactly what he is, which is a mind of extraordinary range that cannot always be directed toward specific, deliverable outputs. Francis does not need a painting. He needs the conversation, and Leonardo can give that as long as his mind is working. He continues his notebooks. He designs a new royal palace for Romorantin on a different riverside. A project that is never built, but whose designs show an architectural ambition of the first order. He plans a canal that would connect the Loire and the Saône, an engineering project of scale. He works on geometry. Late in life, he has become obsessed with the mathematical properties of curved forms, with problems of squaring the circle and similar classical puzzles that have resisted solution for centuries. And in the winter of 1517, something goes wrong with his right hand. The exact medical cause is uncertain. The most plausible explanation is a stroke, possibly one of a series, that damages the motor pathways controlling the dominant hand. He can still walk, still think, still dictate and instruct. But the hand that is drawn and painted for 50 years no longer responds as it should. The brush is too heavy. The line wavers. The precision that was as natural as breathing has become effortful and approximate. A cardinal from Italy, Luigi d'Aragona, visits Leonardo in October 1517, accompanied by his secretary Antonio de Beatis. De Beatis records the visit in his diary. He describes an old man, somewhat paralyzed in his right hand, who can no longer create works of great beauty, but who still has an assistant, meaning Melzi, who works with good facility. He describes 3 paintings that Leonardo shows them: the Mona Lisa, the St. John the Baptist, and a Virgin and Child with St. Anne. He is still showing them to visitors, still proud of them, still, in his way, working. The last 2 years are quiet. He writes his will with a Florentine notary in Amboise on April 23, 1519. He leaves his vineyard outside Milan to Salai. He leaves everything else, the notebooks, the drawings, the remaining paintings, all the physical artifacts of 50 years of thought, to Francesco Melzi. To his half-brothers in Florence, he leaves a sum of money. To his household servants, he leaves various small items. The will is a practical document. It does not contain any statement of philosophy or any final reflection on his life. He is not, apparently, in the mood for grand gestures. He is settling his affairs. On May 2, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci dies. He is 67 years old. Melzi writes a letter to Leonardo's half-brothers in Florence describing the death. He writes with evident grief. He calls Leonardo the best of fathers. He says the loss is so painful that he cannot express it, and that it will grieve him as long as he lives. Francis, I may or may not have been present at the death. A legend, which developed in the decades afterward and was circulated enthusiastically in France, holds that Leonardo died in the king's arms, that Francis was with him in his final moments, holding him as he passed. The legend is almost certainly false in its literal form. The king was most likely elsewhere that day. But the emotional truth it encodes is real. The relationship between the French king and the Italian painter was genuine, warm, and mutual in a way that Leonardo's relationships with patrons had not always been. He is buried in the chapel of Saint-Florentin at the Château d'Amboise. During the wars of religion, the chapel is damaged and the graves disturbed. His remains are moved, consolidated with others, moved again. A memorial is eventually placed in the chapel of Saint-Hubert at Amboise, and that is where visitors now pay their respects. Whether the bones beneath the memorial are actually his is appropriately uncertain. After his death, Melzi carries the notebooks to his family estate near Milan. He spends years organizing them, reading them, caring for them. He does not publish them. He lives with them for the rest of his life. After Melzi's death, his family does not know what they have. Visitors come and take pages. Collectors buy fragments. The great collection scatters across Europe, to Spain, to England, to France, to Germany. The Codex Atlanticus, containing over 1,000 pages, eventually finds its permanent home in the Ambrosiana Library in Milan. The anatomical drawings go to the Royal Library at Windsor, where they are rediscovered and recognized only in the 19th century. The Codex Leicester, Leonardo's most extensive writing on water, the element that obsessed him most, passes through a series of private collections and is purchased at auction in 1994 by Bill Gates for $30 million. The notebooks are now largely available in facsimile and in transcription. Scholars have spent decades deciphering the mirror script and translating the compressed, idiosyncratic language of the notes. What they have found is a mind at work across tens of thousands of pages, curious, methodical, impatient, sometimes wrong, more often right, always asking. There is a version of Leonardo's life that is very simple. A genius is born. He paints a few masterpieces. He thinks ideas that are ahead of their time. He dies. His legacy is secure. That version is not false. But it misses almost everything that matters. What Leonardo actually did. What makes him genuinely remarkable as a specific, historically real person rather than as a convenient symbol is not primarily the paintings. The paintings are the most visible evidence of something larger. The larger thing is the quality of attention he brought to every single object, phenomenon, and question he encountered for 67 years. He was not trying to be a great painter. He was trying to understand how things work. The paintings were, in an important sense, byproducts, the results of looking so hard at the human face, at light, at shadow, at water, at the structure of living bodies, that the understanding accumulated in his hand and emerged on the surface as art. The notebooks are the real testament. And the notebooks are, at their deepest level, a record of someone who refused to accept received explanations. He describes himself in those pages as a man without letters, someone who learned from experience rather than from the authority of books. He is being somewhat disingenuous, as he did read widely and engage seriously with classical and contemporary scholarship. But the instinct is genuine. He believed that the world, observed with sufficient care and patience, would reveal its own truths, that the eye, trained and undistracted, could reach further than any inherited doctrine. This is what connects him, across 5 centuries, to anyone who has ever worked with their hands, learned something from the material itself, something that no manual could have taught. The wood pushes back against the tool and teaches you about its grain. The paint on the surface behaves in a way you did not expect and shows you something about how pigment and light interact. The object reveals itself if you pay attention. Leonardo paid attention for 67 years to everything, and the records he left of that attention, in drawings, in paintings, in the compressed and sometimes cryptic language of the notebooks, are among the most extraordinary documents in human history. The aortic valve research, confirmed 400 years after he drew it. The atmospheric perspective, described correctly in his notes in the 1490s and formalized in meteorological science in the 19th century. The botanical drawings that trained eyes in the 18th century, would find essentially accurate in their structural detail. The geological observations, the age of the Earth, the formation of mountains, the evidence of ancient seas in the rock strata of Tuscany, that had to wait for Hutton and Lyell to be formalized, and that Leonardo had essentially understood by looking at the hills above Vinci. He was not the first person to think carefully about these things. Natural philosophers before him had observed, theorized, experimented. But he did something that almost none of them did. He brought to natural observation the same fierce precision that he brought to painting a face. He looked at a piece of geological rock with the same intensity that he looked at the expression of a woman sitting for a portrait. He brought his whole visual intelligence to everything, and he did it alone. Without institutions, without peers who shared his range, without publication, without the feedback of an intellectual community that could have built on his work. What he produced remained in his notebooks, private, unread by the people who might have used it. Melzi preserved the pages. But Melzi was not a scientist and not a publisher. The great anatomical treatise that could have transformed medicine was never assembled. The hydraulic insights that could have advanced engineering were never formalized. The anatomical drawings sat in a royal library in England for centuries before anyone recognized them for what they were. This is the tragedy at the center of Leonardo's story, not his personal unhappiness, which was real but manageable, and not his unfinished paintings, which are at least visible and admirable, but the enormous gap between what he discovered and what he communicated. He was the most important natural scientist of his age, and nobody in his age knew it. He discovered things that changed medicine and engineering and physics, and none of it changed anything in his own century because he kept it in private notebooks that nobody read. The reason for this is complex and probably not reducible to a single explanation. He was constitutionally incapable of the sustained, linear commitment that publication requires. He was always moving to the next question. He may have feared the church's reaction to some of what he had observed and concluded. He may have simply lacked the collaborators, the people who could have done what Melzi could not. Organized, edited, translated, distributed, or perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps he was not interested in influencing his contemporaries. Perhaps the notebooks were not a failed attempt at publication, but a successful private enterprise. A conversation he was having with himself and with the world that did not require an audience to be complete. That is a strange kind of greatness. A greatness that exists not in the accumulation of acknowledged achievement, but in something harder to name. The record of a mind that could not look at the world without trying to understand it completely. A greatness that produced the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper as visible proof, but whose deeper evidence is 5,000 pages of mirror writing that almost no one read for 300 years. Consider what those pages contain. Taken together, they contain the most accurate anatomical illustrations made before the modern era. Drawings of the spine, the shoulder, the hand, the heart, the fetus, the brain that trained eyes in the 19th century found essentially correct. They contain the first correct description of arteriosclerosis as a distinct pathological process. They contain the first description of the role of the aortic sinus in valve closure. They contain observations about the behavior of light in the atmosphere that correctly explain why distant objects appear blue and why the sky is the color it is. Observations that anticipate what physics will formalize 3 centuries later. They contain the first systematic study of fluid dynamics in the Western tradition. Pages and pages of observations about the behavior of water in channels, around obstacles, at junctions, in turbulent conditions, that anticipate the mathematical treatment of fluids by Newton, Bernoulli, and their successors. They contain correct observations about geological time, The recognition that the rock strata of Tuscany record processes that took millions of years, not the 6,000 years that the biblical chronology of his day demanded. They contain the first serious engineering analysis of flight, including correct descriptions of the principle of lift, the role of wing curvature, and the mechanics of soaring. And scattered among all of this are things that do not fit neatly into any category. The fables, the jokes, the shopping lists, the observations about social behavior, the notes on how to handle a difficult patron, the rules for the behavior of apprentices in a workshop, the dreams he records on waking, the games and riddles he invents for court entertainments. A man thinking, in other words. Not performing thought, not constructing a public intellectual identity. Just thinking on page after page, in mirror script, in the privacy that the mirror script provides. This is what makes the notebooks extraordinary beyond the specific discoveries they contain. They are a record of a mind in motion, caught at its most natural and least performative. Most of what intellectual history preserves is the result. The published work, the formal argument, the conclusion after the process has been cleaned up and made presentable. The notebooks of Leonardo are the process itself. The dead ends, the corrections, the revision of a drawing 2 pages after the first attempt. Because looking at the first attempt taught him something about what was wrong with it. He was also, it should be said, wrong about things. Not often, and not about the big things, but wrong. He believed that the heart generated heat, a very old idea from Aristotle, that he accepted despite the evidence of his own dissections. He had theories about how the visual image formed in the eye that were partially incorrect. He believed, in some passages, that the sun moved around the earth, the Ptolemaic model that Copernicus was quietly working to overturn during roughly the same years. He was a man of his time as well as ahead of it, and the mixture is important to keep in mind. His genius was not a guarantee of correctness. It was a method of investigation, and methods of investigation, applied with care, tend to correct their own errors over time, which is partly why so much of what he concluded turns out to be right. In the last drawings we have from Leonardo's hand, made around 1517 or 1518, when his right hand could barely hold a pen, he draws water, enormous floods, biblical in scale, water destroying everything, mountains dissolving into the flood, trees torn up, cities swept away. The drawings are violent and catastrophic and almost hallucinatory in their energy, which is strange, coming from an old man sitting in a comfortable house in the Loire Valley who has no particular reason to be thinking about apocalyptic floods, unless he has always been thinking about it. Unless the flood was always there, underneath the anatomical studies and the military designs and the painting technique and the music and the theatrical spectacles. The fundamental reality of water, which moves without ceasing, which takes the shape of whatever contains it, which erodes everything eventually, which neither hurries nor stops, was the thing he came back to again and again, from the irrigation channels of Vinci to the last drawings he was able to make. He spent 60 years trying to fully understand it. He never did. He kept trying anyway. The workshop is quiet now. The tools are back on the wall. The oak I have been working on sits covered, waiting for tomorrow. Leonardo da Vinci died on May 2nd, 1519, in a small house in Amboise, France. He was 67 years old. Francesco Melzi, who had stayed at his side for 13 years, wrote to Leonardo's half-brothers in Florence to tell them. He called Leonardo the best of fathers. He said the grief was more than he could express. The King of France, a young man who had spent 3 years visiting an old Italian painter almost every day through an underground passage between their two houses, reportedly wept. What Leonardo left behind was not a completed body of work. It was something stranger and more durable. A record of a mind that could not stop asking. 5,000 pages of mirror script, scattered eventually across the libraries of Europe, containing the answers to questions that science would not formally ask for another 200 years. The aortic valve, the mechanics of lift, the age of the earth, the pathology of hardened arteries, the correct geometry of the human spine, the functioning of the eye, the behavior of water in turbulent channels. All of it there in notebooks that almost no one read. When a research team published a paper in Nature in 1969 confirming the role of aortic sinus vortices in heart valve closure, using glass models and fluid tracers, they cited Leonardo da Vinci. He had drawn the same experiment, reached the same conclusion, and filed it in a notebook in 1513. That is the particular kind of greatness Leonardo achieved. Not the greatness of fame, though he has that. Not the greatness of influence, though history has absorbed his paintings completely. The greatness of having been right, quietly, alone, in a private notebook, 5 centuries before anyone checked. The Mona Lisa is in the Louvre. The Last Supper is in Milan. The anatomical drawings are in Windsor. The Codex Leicester, his notebooks on water, was purchased in 1994 for $30 million, and somewhere in the hills above a small Tuscan town called Vinci. The irrigation channels still carry water down to the valley floor. A boy once stood there, watching how it moved, asking why it slowed when the channel widened. He never quite stopped asking. Good night.